My new book, Awake, Observe, Shape, Transform, is now available on Amazon, along with the 90-day transformation journal. You'll find a link to these things in the episode description. Also, if you'd like to support this work, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers with no locked content, just a way to say I value this. You can also visit the site and check out the growing merch store, shirts, tanks, hats, and learn about one-on-one sessions with me by clicking the About button. And don't forget, the YouTube page has the podcast and binaural beats for meditation, rest, and sleep. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today's episode is a very special one. It's one that I've been wanting to do for a while, and if you've been with me for a few episodes, you probably saw this coming. I've danced around it a few times, hinted at it here and there, but today we're going to really get into it, or at least as much as we can, because it's a pretty vast subject and still very active and still unfolding. But today we're going to talk about the Chris Bledsoe case. His encounters, his story, and more importantly, what his experience might mean for us. Not just as curious people watching the skies, but as spiritual beings navigating a very strange time on Earth, especially recently with everything that's happening in the Middle East. Now, before you tune out and go, oh man, not another UFO story, please stick with me, because this isn't just about UFOs. And as someone who has been actively interested in this topic for their entire life, studying it, reading about it, this case is very different. Trust me, I'm someone who has been studying the fringe my entire life in one capacity or another. Everything from government conspiracies to the paranormal. And this case, this Chris Bledsoe case, is beyond just interesting. It goes very deep and, in my opinion, pulls a lot of things together. You see, this case is about what happens when reality cracks open, when the veil lifts, and when the divine shows up wearing essentially a disguise. This is about us, what we're doing here, what's being asked of us, and how the mysterious might be calling us into deep transformation. So let's begin. Chris Bledsoe and the Angelic UFOs, what his story means for our spiritual awakening. Struggling on how to start this episode because there are so many things that I feel need to be set up front. But I do believe that this case, if you study it, is at least part of a missing link within several stories. For things like, why are humans here? What happens when we die? Is there really good and evil? And does the government even know anything about any of this? I really believe that if he's right, if Chris is telling the truth, then his story could answer at least some of these questions. And just so you know, this is going to be a favorable view of Chris Bledsoe. Is his case perfect? Well, none of these cases can be, that is, unless you're the one experiencing it. But in short, I believe him. I believe his family, and I most certainly believe the literally hundreds of people that he's been taking to do sky watches. I also believe in Stephen Greer's CE5 method, for that matter. Both of these men are essentially saying the same thing. Both of these men have given, to those of us that have paid close attention to the phenomena, one of the missing pieces, which is consciousness. And in this case, I mean capital C consciousness, not lowercase c consciousness. So if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know that my now wife, Christy, yes, we got married recently, and I have had several experiences with lights in the sky. On our wedding night, we saw them and you know, you can say what you want, right? And this is what I meant before. None of these cases are perfect unless you're the one experiencing it. You're experiencing it, only you know. And that's what makes the phenomena so difficult, right? And this is when I talk about subjective and objective, and that like subjectivity is all there is. And that's good news unless you're somebody that needs everything to be objectively true for you and moreover for everybody else. But we've had several experiences, right? Even lights in trees, like in a forest. My mother had experiences, one by herself, one with her friend Lorraine, which I was fortunate enough to hear them recount together before she died, and two with me. This coupled with all of the other anomalous, or what some would call paranormal experiences that we've had lately involving prayer and our mothers, who have both passed on. All I can say is that this life is more beautiful than we're being told. It's more magical than we could have imagined, and that we can maintain conscious contact with what I would call, for the case, for ease and diplomatic purposes, I'd simply call it the unseen. So if your mind is closed, try to pry it open just a bit for this episode. And for those of you with an open mind, I would love to remind you that the mind can become so open that it works against us, so open that it actually closes in certain ways. So stay open, stay skeptical, but never become a cynic. Now, I'm not going to retell the entire Chris Bledsoe story here. That's not what I do. Besides, there are literally hours and hours of this man and his family telling their story much better than I ever could. But if I could recommend an interview, it would be his appearance on the Danny Jones podcast. He appears there with his daughter, Emily. Chris's son, Ryan Bledsoe, also has a podcast called Bledsoe Said So, that Chris has been on a few times, but there's really great episodes where they just read through Chris Bledsoe, his father, just read through his hypnotic regression transcripts, which are very, very interesting. There are also great interviews with Ryan Bledsoe and Chris Bledsoe on the Limitless podcast, which I highly recommend. Also, sheer coincidence, both of these podcasts are based in Florida. So, Florida people. Either way, give it a chance. Now, let's get into it. So, Chris Bledsoe, a regular guy from North Carolina. He's not a Harvard astrophysicist. He's a father. He's a businessman, a builder. At one point, a very devout Christian. Now, I think he would probably say he's just more spiritual. He's also someone who had a profound life-altering encounter with what can only be described as the mystery or the mysterious other, capital O. And that encounter seems to be continuing to this day. Now, I also want to say that while I don't have a problem with his account itself, like the experience, I believe him. I also understand the brow furrowing that some of you will inevitably experience when you look into this. I do the same thing, but I've read his book, UFO of God. I listened to hours of this guy talk, and as someone who has absorbed, read and studied and been trekking up this mountain for 29 years, I have to say that this is a very, very, very special case. There's something here, but you have to keep yourself from getting rutted to appreciate it. In fact, I'm going to make a very bold statement right now. Chris Bledsoe's book, UFO of God, gave me the same feeling that I got from Paramahansa Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi. So please give it a shot. Now, back in 2007, Chris Bledsoe, was in very deep suffering. He was going through severe depression, a financial collapse. It was 2007, like we all felt 2008, if you're old enough. And he was even battling Crohn's disease, which had gotten to an almost unmanageable place. So he went out to fish one evening on the Cape Fear River with his son and some employees. They just finished a big job. So he took them fishing to celebrate. However, though the other fellas were celebrating, Chris was not. When Chris tells the story and explains what was happening in his life, you see that it was truly what listeners of this podcast understand to be the dark night of the soul, or the yoga of dejection. Arjuna and Krishna in the very beginning, where Arjuna is just like, I can't, right? It's the lowest low. It was a crisis of faith. In fact, while everyone was fishing, Chris was walking off into the woods just to pray and be alone. And I would say he was probably at the end of his rope, is what it sounds like. Now, I have not had this many things go off at once, right? Not like Chris did at this time. But I've certainly come close. And I believe that though the troughs of life can be, can obviously be tough for most people, right? In some ways, for people of faith, regardless of what that faith is in, what that belief is, those troughs, those low places can be unbelievably painful. And why do I say that? Well, faith, to have faith in something, requires doubt, right? Otherwise, it's just knowing, right? It's confident. Faith and confidence are two different things. And personally, I find something beautiful about faith, something so uniquely human about it, right? It's a doubt that you don't want. You don't want that doubt, right? Because you want what you believe to be true. And when that desire for something beautiful and spiritual to be true is possibly false or a sheer waste of time or whatever, it is heartbreaking. So this idea of a crisis of faith is more than just scary. It's beyond sadness. It's a soulful pain. But what occurred was something that ripped open the fabric of what Chris Bledsoe considered reality. It ruined his life for a very long time. He calls it the 7 years of darkness. He and his family were ostracized and ridiculed. He couldn't go to church. His kids were being bullied, and it almost ruined his marriage. And as I said at the start, I'm not going to recount the entire story, right? He tells it best, and I encourage you to hear him out. But what he saw were orbs of light. He thought it was the sun. He experienced missing time. He was overcome with a sense of awe and terror. It was a numinous experience, if you're familiar with that term. He and his son were essentially harassed by the phenomena for an entire evening. But most importantly, he encountered beings that he would later describe as angelic. In fact, if you do your reading and you listen to this podcast, they were the same beings that Saint Teresa of Avila encountered, the seraphim, the burning ones. In fact, during that time that Chris was missing, his son, who was with the men that were fishing, and his son, Chris Jr., was about 16 or 17 at the time. After hours of his dad being missing, he was in a panic and he went looking for him. And what Chris Bledsoe Jr. encountered was those beings. He had an experience of his own. And to kind of gloss over the story, again, I'm not going to retell it. Chris returned to the fishing spot. The men were frantic. Chris Jr. was missing because he went to look for his dad. So Chris Sr., his dad, went looking for his son. And when Chris Bledsoe Sr. found his son, he was terrified. His son was hiding under bushes because he had seen the seraphim. So when Chris and Chris Jr. returned to the fishing spot, everyone packed up and ran. The men were freaked out because here's Chris Sr. and Chris Jr. both describing the same thing. The men were terrified. They saw the orbs. Then they saw this craft. Everyone being scared. The crazy thing was that Chris Sr. was in awe. Right? So you think of something being numinous, you're in a sense of awe and terror at the same time. He'd kind of shifted from terror and awe into just amazement. He didn't feel afraid of them, right? And the Chris driving the truck and all the men in the truck and Chris Jr., they were essentially followed by this craft, by these orbs. It was chaos. And again, I encourage you to hear Chris's story from him. I don't want to tell it. There's so much to it. Now, if you're listening to this, right, and you've had your own awakening moment, something that, Chris is going through here, whether it came through meditation, suffering, psychedelics, or just, you're sitting up there watching the stars one day, then maybe this doesn't sound so crazy to you. Maybe the idea of something being numinous isn't so odd. Maybe you've felt that presence before. The intelligence behind the curtain. Maybe you've seen lights. Maybe you've seen something truly anomalous that gave you that numinous feeling of awe mixed with fear or terror. See, this Chris Bledsoe story isn't just about what he saw. If you get into what he saw, it's just another UFO story. But this one, it's about how those encounters changed him and how the messages he received align almost perfectly with ancient spiritual teachings from around the world. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I thought the same things. And I'm not going to spend this episode trying to cut you off, but I will say again, find his episode on the Danny Jones podcast and watch it. Just watch it. Listen to it. I recommend Danny's podcast because I believe that of all of the hours I've listened to this story, even the book, the book doesn't even do it justice when you hear Chris and his daughter Emily help him tell the story. That's the best. That Danny Jones one it's handled in the best way. Now, here's what makes Bledsoe's story different from the classic alien abduction narrative. The beings weren't described as aliens, not in the traditional sense. In fact, he encounters 5, essentially, the orbs, the smaller children of the orbs, that's the seraphim, and the taller version, and finally the one who he calls the lady. So if you do any cursory Google search of Chris, the lady is always front and center. But he didn't come away talking about spaceships and technology. He came away talking about light, about forgiveness, about spiritual awakening. So let that sink in. This wasn't a nuts and bolts experience. This was mystical. This was transformative. If you are a dork like me and you've been into this for any amount of time, it aligns with what Jacques Vallée, I think, essentially believes. So, Chris didn't go looking for this. Right? He didn't want it. It disrupted his life, his family, his peace of mind. But instead of running from it or trying to monetize it, though later there's a book, which I'm sure he made money, he did something kind of rare. He just let it transform him, despite the social pressure to stop talking about it. Right? This is another one of those things, whether it's Helena Blavatsky or Chris Bledsoe. Like, no one, I'll say this for experiencers, no one's life ever got better because of it. Maybe Bledsoe's, I don't know. He seems perfectly happy with his family and everything. But I always find it interesting that we jump to the monetization of experience. So, I don't know. I really encourage you to hear him out. But the central figure in Chris's encounters is who he calls the lady. And let me just say, when you hear the lady in this context, your mind might jump to some Catholic iconography, the Virgin Mary, the Divine Feminine, Sophia in a Kabbalistic sense. And you wouldn't be wrong, right? The lady has appeared to Chris a few times. I believe typically he gets some sort of contact around Easter every year. But during one of his early experiences, she gave him visions of the future, visions of cataclysm, and also visions of hope. He's said that her message is simple but kind of urgent, that humanity's at a crossroads. We need to return to love. We need to return to our spiritual center, or we're going to destroy ourselves. And a very ominous and prophetic statement that he's been making from the start for these many years is that when Iran and Israel begin firing rockets, they will make themselves known. They will return. That conflict will signal some sort of the end of an era. And we will enter a new age, the age of Aquarius, or the Satya Yuga, an age where the phenomena will reveal itself, an age where there will be a shift in human consciousness. He says that there is a true force for good, like that it's a real thing, but there's also, within these power structures, a force that wants darkness. Well, here we are, and this is why we're doing this episode. Now, let me say something here, and just know that this is not Chris Bledsoe's opinion. This is my understanding based on what I've learned. Everything in this multiverse consumes. It feeds on something, and for some of these beings, that something is pain, suffering, darkness. And that dark force infiltrates the minds of many people at the top pulling the strings. Why? Because if death and destruction create the ripples of pain through a society, through a culture, then they can consume it, feed on it. And who better to control than the people at the top who can create the circumstances by which a lot of suffering can happen all at once? So there's one of my beliefs that sounds crazy at first, but the more you roll it around in your head, you start to see it. Now, back to Chris Bledsoe. So Chris's experiences weren't ignored. In fact, far from it. In fact, people from the CIA, NASA, and the Department of Defense all came knocking. They came to him. Think about that. He didn't call them. They came to him. This is a verifiable fact. High-level government officials have sat in this man's backyard and looked at the sky. Why? Because they know something's going on. They know the phenomena is real. And they know that people like Chris Bledsoe, who are having positive transformative experiences, might hold a key. They want to know what he knows. They want to know why these beings chose him. So if the people who run satellites, control drone fleets, and sit on UFO task forces are paying attention to this guy, then maybe we should too, especially now with everything that has been in the news about what amounts to the government using psychic abilities to summon craft. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I can't get into it all here. Go find out for yourself. Search Jake Barber. Now, let's bring this back down to earth. What does Chris Bledsoe's story have to do with you? Well, maybe everything. Because his story isn't really about lights in the sky. It's about our divine origin. It's about inner contact with the divine. I believe, and I think Chris would agree, that these encounters they're part of a much bigger shift in consciousness. A thinning of the veil, a breakdown of the old materialist worldview, and an invitation to come home spiritually, mentally, emotionally. These sightings are happening more and more. With Chris publicizing it, with Stephen Greer's CE5 method, people are having experiences. Here's the truth. You don't have to see orbs of light in your backyard to be in contact with the divine. You don't need a close encounter to start waking up. You just need to listen. You just need to stop running, to get quiet, to be still. You need to be open to the possibility that you are more than what you've been told, and that the universe is more alive, more intelligent, and more compassionate than you were ever led to believe. Now, let's zoom out and look at this through a historical lens. Think of Ezekiel's vision in the Bible, wheels within wheels, glowing beings, or Arjuna's vision of Krishna's true form in the Bhagavad Gita, so dazzling and so terrifying, numinous, he can barely look at it. It was for Arjuna a numinous experience, or the Buddhist descriptions of devas appearing to advanced meditators, people that got quiet. It's always been there. What we call UFOs today may very well be a spiritual phenomena in disguise. In fact, that's what Chris Bledsoe says. He's like, this isn't a UFO thing. This is a spiritual phenomena. And it's adjusted to match our cultural lens. That is good news. I mean, if you saw a flying disc, a flying disc on fire or a ball of fire 2,000 years ago, you'd call it chariot of the gods. Today it's UFO, then a UAP, and now, to begin adjusting to our minds, the government calls them drones. Different labels, same mystery. The point is that now they appear as light. And I think that them appearing to more people as orbs, as plasma, whatever you want to call it, I think is very telling for our spiritual development. I mean that in a good way. In every tradition, these encounters come with transformation, humility, responsibility, not power, not domination, not control, but service. Every saint that had an experience with the burning ones, the seraphim, were driven deeper into their faith. Now, one of the things that stands out about Chris Bledsoe is his sincerity. He's not flashy. He's not trying to convince you of anything. He just keeps telling his story. He's even been tested by government researchers who have recorded the lights around his property. But more than that, he lives a life of prayer, contemplation, and faith. And you know what? That might be the secret ingredient. Because over and over again, whether it's saints, sages, mystics, or experiencers like Bledsoe, it's always the same pattern. The universe responds to sincerity. The veil lifts for those who are truly seeking. Not to be cool, not to be special, but to know the truth, to love more fully, to live more wisely. Last night, we had an experience. I had a very sincere feeling in my body. Every time that I've had these experiences, it's always that way. Either Christy or me, but we're in a very loving place. It's never when I'm feeling the most down, even if it's a spiritual desperation, like the dark night of the soul. It's not then. But I went outside and I looked at the sky and I said, we got married. And I was talking to my mom. I was talking to her mom. I was talking to whoever would listen. And then here come two lights and they crisscross. And then we thanked somebody else. And then here comes another light. Say what you want, right? As I said, these experiences are not perfect, right? One night, 5 of them in formation of a triangle, flying through the air slowly and then shifting, changing formation. It's real. I mean, it's, but there is something connected to consciousness. So anyway, how do we apply this? What do we do with this? How do we make this real? Well, let me offer you a few things to think about. First, ask yourself what you're afraid to see. What parts of reality, inner or outer, are you avoiding because they challenge your worldview? Challenge your worldview. Challenge it. You don't know. You think you know. So what are you afraid of that makes you lean to one side or the other? It's a good question. Another one would be begin a dialogue with the unknown. You don't need to see lights, but just go outside. Look at the stars. And say, I'm listening. Then listen. Watch. So many people that have dismissed me or anyone else with these experiences claims to have never seen anything. Well, then I guess it's not true, or I guess we're all just crazy, or we're all just looking at airplanes and satellites. Or is it that you don't spend time with it? You treat it like everything else in your life. You approach it with a half a heart. You spend a few hours with it, maybe a week, and you're done. Because how you do one thing is how you do many things. I'll bet there's a pattern there. Another one would be examine your beliefs. Not to discard them, but to see whether they're yours or someone else's. Are they keeping you small? Are they keeping you asleep? Are they sincere? Do you mean it? Or was it a reality you were beaten over the head with until you repeated it back to them, as Carlos Castaneda would say? Another one would be practice inner contact through meditation, prayer, journaling. Start the conversation with the unseen. Start the contact from within, continuous conscious contact. And again, that might seem like a lot for some people. And it probably is. But that's not our problem. And some people feel so foolish in prayer, talking to God, having a relationship with the unseen, because it's not scientific and real and can't be proven, but they will become fully invested in some fucking show, and it'll get them worked up, right? To where they can't sleep, or they become fanatical fans of it. But this part, the prayer and the meditation, that's fucking ridiculous. And lastly, I would say stay grounded, stay kind, stay humble. The most powerful spiritual experiences, they don't make you feel like a god. They make you realize everyone else is one too, right? That we're all connected to it. Every time Christy or I have seen something, it was like we knew we were going to see something. And boom, there it was. I did an episode a while back about how we connect or confront the phenomena. I suggest you go back and listen. So, look, I don't know exactly who or what Chris Bledsoe encountered. And honestly, that's not even the point. The point is there is something more, something vast, something watching, and maybe, just maybe, it loves us more than we've been taught. Maybe it loves us even though we don't know it. But love isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's a very one-sided thing, like an emotional, angry teenager and their parents that are just loving them through it. Sometimes love says, wake up. Sometimes love says, you're running out of time. And sometimes love says, the only way forward is within. Chris Bledsoe's story is not about aliens, it's about us. It's about remembering, it's about transforming, it's about turning our attention back to the sacred before it's too late. I love you. You came back for me, and I will always come back for you. Thank you. If the infinite spark of being has brought you any value, consider supporting the work. And you can do that by checking out Awake and the 90-Day Transformation Journal, both now available on Amazon. The links are in the description. If you want to support this work on a monthly basis, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers that have no locked content yet, just support. You can also swing by the website, check out the merch store, learn more about working with me one-on-one, and as always, the YouTube page has full episodes as well as binaural beats to help you with your practice. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, and I love you.